All right, so what we were talking about is what is a genotype and how does that come into play? So we see the phenotypes here. So now we need to go to understanding the genotype. What are the type of genes that are inside this plant and this plant that enable it to have offspring like this? And what genes are inside here that enable it to have offspring like this? So in order to understand that, we have to understand the cardinal rule of genetics. And the cardinal rule of genetics, I don't know if it's actually called the cardinal rule of genetics or if I'm just making that up. So maybe not say that outside of anywhere outside of my class. But the cardinal rule of genetics, I'm going to say now, is that you get half of your DNA from your mom and you get half from dad. All right, so you get half the DNA from one parent and you get the other half of your DNA from another parent. Now this is always true. I just don't know if it's called the cardinal rule. The cardinal rule. I don't know if it's actually called the cardinal rule, but what is important is that you do realize that half of the DNA comes from each parent. So half from mom and half from dad. Okay? Now, it is possible to have different versions of the same gene. Different versions of the same gene. So the gene that we're going to be talking about here, since we're dealing with the tall and short phenotypes, the gene we're talking about here is height, the height gene. So when we're talking about the height gene, there are actually two different alleles of height gene in these pea plants. Okay, so allele 1, I'm going to write allele 1 is tall. So if allele 1, if you were to look at allele 1 and what does it code for in the DNA, allele 1 would code for a tall plant. But there's another version of the gene. There's another version of the gene. And that would be allele 2. And this version of the gene gives us a short pea plant. So you have one allele that would make the plant tall and one allele that would make the plant short. Now, hopefully you were able to get what I mean by allele using context clues, but if not, I'm going to make it really clear right now. Allele basically means version. So this is version 1 of the gene, it'll make the plant tall, and this is version 2 of the gene, it'll make your plant short. So instead of calling these versions, we call these alleles, because you can have many different alleles of a gene, okay? And the allele is actually expressed in the organism. So the allele is really just a version of a gene. So here we have two different alleles for the gene. We have a tall allele and a short allele. A tall allele and a short allele. In this circumstance, well, no, before I get there. So we have a tall allele and a short allele. Now, you're going to get one allele from your mom. You're going to get one allele from your dad. So now, I have a question for you. The question is, if you get, let's say you get one tall allele, well, let me do it this way. I don't want to have to write tall and short every time I do this, so we're going to abbreviate this. Okay, we're going to abbreviate this allele using a certain letter, so that way it's easier for us to write this out. So for the tall allele, I'm going to use a capital T. Okay, so that capital T represents the tall version of the gene, the tall allele. So this is the tall allele. Now, I want to use a letter to represent a short allele, the short version of the gene. And I'm going to use the same letter. I'm going to use a T because I want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that this is the gene, the same gene for height. It's a different allele, it's a different version, but they're both the same gene. They're both the gene for height. This is the tall allele, this is the short allele, the tall version, the short version, but they're both a gene for height. So I'm going to use a T for both of them, but for the short one, I'm going to use a lowercase t. Okay? And so when we have a plant, the plant is going to always have two of these alleles. They got one allele from the mom, one allele from the dad. So they got, let's say mom and dad both give them a tall allele. What do you think the offspring will be if both of their alleles are tall? What do you think the offspring will be? Do you think the offspring will be tall, medium, or short? Okay. Hopefully you said tall, because you know that the genes are what determine what an organism is going to look like. And so if you have genes, if you have two alleles that say it's going to be tall, then it would make sense that the plant would be tall. Likewise, let's say mom and dad both ended up giving short alleles, the short versions of the gene. Short alleles, the short version of the gene. Let's say mom and dad both gave the short alleles, or the short version of a gene. Do you think that baby plant would end up being tall, short, or medium? All right, and hopefully you said short. Because if both alleles, if both versions of the gene are coding for the organism to be short, then it would make sense that the organism is going to be short. Okay? That part is not too hard to understand. Now, what gets tricky and more interesting is what one parent gives us the tall allele, and another parent gives us the short allele. What do you think would happen here? Do you think this plant will be tall, short, or medium? Or do you think it depends which parent gave it which gene? So pause your video real quick and tell me what you think would happen to that plant. Do you think that plant would be tall, short, medium, or would it depend on which parent gave it the tall and which parent gave it the short? Okay, so you paused your video, you've got your prediction in your mind. And so what actually happens here is when you have a tall allele and a short allele, we found out that the plant just ends up being tall. And so if you were thinking back to this example, if you're thinking back to this experiment here, then you may have guessed this one right. But when there's a tall and a short allele, it always ended up being tall. It wasn't medium. It's not sometimes tall and sometimes short. It's always tall when you have the tall allele and the short allele. And so which allele do you think is more dominant over the other? Which one of these alleles is more powerful than the other? The big T or the little t? Which one is more powerful, is overpowering? And hopefully you said the big T. And so what we use to refer to that big T is the word dominant. So we would say the tall allele is dominant. The tall allele is dominant because it overpowers the other one. And this allele is weaker than this allele. So this short allele is weaker. That means if the tall allele is present, it's going to be overpowered by the tall allele. And the word that we use to represent that is recessive. So the recessive allele is the weaker allele. It will be overpowered by the tall allele.